The world has shrunk.
We are in a period of remarkable tension.
Climate change and migration.
Emerging technologies.
Artificial intelligence.
Economic opportunities. Global health.
What is happening in Gaza.
Ukraine and Russia.
The situation in Sudan.
It's a messy world.
Mr. President, welcome to Chicago.
Chicago is a convergence of people and ideas and cultures from all over the world.
We are hoping that by listening to this conversation, we'll then move into real advocacy and action.
Fight is about everyday work, about your everyday contribution. Even small steps matter.
We need to do something now.
This is about democracy.
Inclusion, real inclusion.
Listening to one another.
What do you see as the path forward?
Good evening and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Alisa Bhachu. I am the Executive Director of the Chicago Refugee Coalition, the co-founder of Refugee Can Be, and also an alum of the Emerging Leaders Program here at the Council. So we have a few housekeeping items just to cover quickly. One, we are going to be holding questions until the end, so please refrain. We'll be having 10 or 15 minutes for Q&A at the close of our time. And then also, I'd like to remind everyone that tonight's program is on the record, and any views expressed by speakers are their own. Thank you. We've gathered here tonight to learn about a crisis that has captivated us all. The stories, the reports, revelations of humanitarian abuses beyond comprehension. The collapse of the Assad regime, Syrian flags waving against the blue sky, fists defiant. These images have wrenched our hearts and piqued our hope. The cries of freedom, open airports, lines of people waiting to cross the border into Syria convey that in spite of all Syrians have endured, freedom has prevailed for now. For you and I, these images flash across our screens, on our phones. They are issues that are far away from us. They feel far away from us. They're headlines. But for our panelists tonight, they will be speaking to us from their lived reality. They have seen both the horrors of all that Syrians have endured, as well as these extraordinary moments of liberation and solidarity and joy. So it is my honor tonight to welcome our guests of honor, Suzanne Akhras, and Dr. Zaher Sahloul. Suzanne Akhras is the founder and executive director of the Syrian Community Network. Under her leadership, the network has grown exponentially to become a strong voice for refugee and immigrant rights and a national community-based resettlement organization. Suzanne has led foundations and organizations and fundraised for causes in Chicago and her home country of Syria. She's received multiple awards from UNICEF Chicago and the Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights. Welcome, Suzanne. Dr. Zaher Sahloul is a physician, activist, and humanitarian known for his efforts to improve access to health care and protect medical neutrality in conflict zones and low-income communities around the world. He is also president of Med Global, a nonprofit that delivers healthcare to populations affected by crises worldwide, and has received numerous awards for his work, including the Gandhi Award for Peace and the Heroes Among Us Award from the American Red Cross. And also in researching you, I came across the fact that you were invited by Senator Durbin to be his esteemed guest of honor at last year's State of the Union. Was it last year?
Last year.
Yeah.
I was humbled.
Very, very impressive. So we have so much to unpack this evening, and we're anxious to hear from you both. Let's start with you, Suzanne. Can you tell us about your connection to Syria and share with us a little bit about your story?
Thank you so much, Alisa. Thank you all for having me. Thank you for the Chicago Council on Global Affairs for this kind invitation. And thank all of you for being here on this Thursday night. I know it's been so chilly in Chicago. As Alicia said, I'm Suzanne Akhras. I'm the founder and co-executive director of the Syrian Community Network. I am Syrian American. I was born in Syria and I immigrated to Chicago in 1982. And it has been my home ever since. My organization, the Syrian Community Network, works to resettle Syrian refugees here in Chicago, and many of you and so many people in Chicago have supported and welcomed refugees as their new friends and as their new neighbors. I have 3 children who are born here in Chicago. My oldest works for USAID, which and today is his last day as a part in that position because he's a Biden-Harris appointee. My other son is a business consultant at Accenture, and my daughter is in second year of medical school. Throughout the years, we have been traveling to Syria as when my children were younger to make sure that they are connected with the culture, with the country, with their relatives, to make sure that they visit their grandparents who are Zaher's parents. My parents happen to live here in Chicago, and to keep them engaged and to always keep them within like kind of being proud Syrian Americans. And throughout the years, we've really instilled this on them and told them the stories of Syria, made sure that they feel this connection. And one of the reasons why we left Syria was in 1982. There was an uprising, it was a very difficult time in Syria at that time. And my uncle was imprisoned 2 times. He was tortured, and so we made the decision as a family to come to the United States for seeking a better life, and here we are. And I'm so grateful to be here and to be alive for this second Berlin Wall movement. The first one was when I was 17, when we saw the Berlin Wall come down. It was so amazing and it was historic. And now I consider this Syrian victory in December of 2024 as the second Berlin Wall moment, and it's the most amazing feeling.
Thank you. And over to you, Doctor. Can you share the same with us, your connection to Syria and a bit about your own story?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me. And this is Happy New Year, everyone. And this is my second meeting here in the council. The first one was in 2016 after the Aleppo siege. At that time, I came back from a medical mission in Aleppo, which was at that time labeled as the most dangerous city in the world, because of the barrel bomb that Assad regime and Russia were throwing on the population there. At that time, we had 2 other physicians from Chicago, John Kaler and Samuel Attar, who went with me and came back in a miracle without being injured. We worked in another underground hospital in Aleppo because of the bombing and targeting of doctors and hospitals. I am her husband. And we just last month celebrated the second birthday of our grandson, Nino, we call him. He's the son of Adham and Diana. I came here to Chicago in 1989 after I finished my medical school from Syria, Damascus University, and I did my training at UIC in medicine and then pulmonary and critical care and sleep medicine. And I'm practicing physicians at Christ Advocate Medical Center and also at St. Anthony's Hospital. So 2 hospitals that represent health inequity in Chicago, where one of them is a tertiary center. You have everything that you can imagine in terms of technology and specialists. And one of them is called Safety Network Hospital. and the life expectancy in these two areas are 10 years apart. So that's one of the impetus behind my work in Syria and globally. But when you go to war zone, whether it's Gaza or Syria or Ukraine, you will see the impact of these wars and health inequity on children, on women and elderly, where they die just because there is no hospital, because hospitals are bombed, or just because there is no medication to treat your infection. So that's my story, and I was actually driven into this kind of work because of the crisis in Syria, my homeland. I started by going into medical missions. I went to Syria more than 25 times over the past 14 years. And I witnessed the impact of war on health, on population, on children, on hospitals and doctors. And then we decided with a group of other physicians to kind of apply the lessons learned from Syria at the global level. So that's why we built PET Global. And now we are in the last 7 years since its inception, we served 30 million people in 26 countries. And we keep expanding unfortunately, because of the huge needs.
Yeah. Incredible. Thank you both for sharing a bit about your own personal backgrounds with us so we can get to know you. Tell us about your trip to Syria. What inspired it? Take us there with you on the ground. What were the focus and priorities of your time there, and how did it go?
So my husband and I were on vacation in Japan, of all places. And as we were, as we got there, we started to see that there was a lot of activity happening in Aleppo, and the city of Aleppo was taken by the forces that were, pushing ahead. And then next thing you know, they were in the city of Hama, and then they took the city of Homs, which we come from. We were originally from the city of Homs, and we knew that there's something like this is not your typical, what was happening before. This is different. Zaher kept saying, this is different. I kept saying, no, I don't want to, I can't see this anymore. It's so traumatic. It was really hard in the last, 14 years just to see people fighting for their lives and become refugees, and, like the destruction. And it really took a toll on all of us and people, of course, and the people of Syria. And so when they took the city of Homs, this was different. And then next thing you know, they took over the city of Damascus, and that was it. Like that, we knew that, and I kept telling him, let's go now from Japan. Let's go to let's go to Turkey. Let's do something. We have to go. And then we made it back to Chicago because that has to work. And then we packed our bags, and literally in the next few days we were on our flight to Beirut. And really, like when we and our daughter-in-law Diana Reis, she lives in Washington D.C. She met us in Turkey, and we flew down together in Beirut. And it was just like the most surreal thing, like when we crossed into the border and we were driving to Damascus, and we can start to see like the mountains and the horizon. And, as we're driving into Damascus, like it was just, I felt like my soul came back, like suddenly, So, yeah, I mean, like, you're returning from the dead, because there's something that in the last 14 years just, it was so grueling, and it was so difficult to see people in such anguish and in such despair. I kept thinking about that child, Aylan Kurdi. I don't know if you remember, in 2015, there was that little child that washed up on the Turkish shore who drowned. And because at that time, so many refugees were trying to flee and escape for their lives. And I kept thinking, like, gosh, how did we fail this little boy? And so many of the children that drowned, and so many of the people who drowned who were trying to escape. And here we are now in 2024 driving into Damascus. So that was like so surreal. But I really felt like my soul came back. And then just seeing and thinking about all the refugee families that I serve here in Chicago. Thinking about Firas, Dr. Firas, one of the refugees who came to Chicago, was a doctor. He was imprisoned and tortured for 6 months. He lost like 50 kilos, and when he came out, he and his wife became refugees in Turkey, and then they came to Chicago, and he recertified, and now he's doing his residency. I kept thinking about this moment is for them. for the people who were displaced, that this is their moment. And it was just really, really so amazing. But there's other stories that I want to share, but I'll let Zaher share his reflections of going into Syria. Being in Damascus, we stopped at the Umayyad square where all the people were gathered, and it's the famous kind of like sword structure that people gather in there. And then when we drove to Homs, also seeing the clock tower in Homs, this is the famous clock tower where people gather, and they did the first demonstrations that took place in Homs were around that clock tower, and now it was like we're driving into this space, and it felt like I was in a dream.
Oh, sounds extraordinary.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much for sharing, Doctor.
I cannot add more to what Suzanne has mentioned. A few points. When I was in Japan and Damascus fell and the regime was announced that Assad left to Russia, I cried. I don't cry often. My wife told me, you have to show your emotions, but at that time I could not hold my emotions, and I cried because, I was raised in Syria with Assad, the father, being the president throughout my life. I think some of you may know him, Hafiz al-Assad. At that time, he committed a major massacre in the city called Hama, which is just 20 minutes north of my city, Homs, where at least 30,000 people were killed. There was a famous chapter in Thomas Friedman's book, From Beirut to Jerusalem, called Hama's Rule. And it talks about the brutality of this regime and how the fact that it does not have any consideration for human rights. I was in high school at that time, and that defined my youth. In Syria, there is a saying that don't speak because walls have ears. So always when I was growing, people, my family, my parents prevented me from speaking politics because they were afraid from what we call it in Syria, al-mukhabarat, the equivalent of the FBI, but different kind of FBI. So every other one spy on everyone in Syria, and they report to the regime, and then you may end up in a dungeon and no one knows what happens to you. And the first thing that we've seen after the liberation, we call it liberation of Syria from this regime, is that the fact that people went to the prison, Sednaya prison, and they opened the doors, and then you have this flood of people who looked horrible because they've been in a dungeon under torture for a long time. There were an estimated of 136,000 people who were forcefully disappeared before the liberation of Syria from the Assad regime. Only 24,000 of them showed up. That means the rest have been tortured to death. And now we are hearing about all of these stories of people who disappeared and went into the prison. And, Suzanne mentioned Firas al-Jawish, the physician who came here to Chicago, and now he's finishing his residency. He told me about the torture that is happening in the prison. And these stories, by the way, every Syrian knows stories about torture, unfortunately. We went one time in a travel to Dachau concentration camp, and we've seen the horror of the concentration camp. But actually in Syria, you are seeing what concentration camp and what prison is in the 21st century. So Firas told me about every day he was allowed to go from his cell, where you have 50 people crowded in a small area, to the washroom. And every day there is 2 or 3 who die because of infection, because of tuberculosis, because of a heart attack, because of the extreme torture. So these are the things that allowed us in Syria. When you mentioned your introduction, Syrians are happy. Syrians are happy because of this horror that lasted for 54 years and now suddenly lifted. Bashar al-Assad is my classmate from medical school, and he was below average medical student. And he cheated in the exams. And no one expected him to be as brutal or more brutal than his father. But he actually outdone his father in brutality by using chemical weapons more than 300 times, by attacking hospitals. More than 650 hospitals were bombed by the Assad regime, who is a physician himself. More than 900 doctors were killed. People were put under siege. Children died because of malnutrition around Damascus. And that's why now people are really happy. The first thing that I've seen in Damascus, in Syria, is that you feel the air is happy. You have jubilant population, children, women, men from all backgrounds who are happy for the first time in their life because now they can breathe suddenly. So that's what happens when you go into a country with this. This doesn't happen in your lifetime. Once in a lifetime, or maybe it doesn't happen in your lifetime, that you have a regime that lasted for 55 years, and some of you are familiar with Ceausescu in Romania, or even the Castro regime in Cuba, and suddenly they're out, and people now are talking about the future.
Yes. Thank you for sharing that with us. Maybe transition from the experience you've had with the Assad regime and the personal connections as well to the new de facto leader, Jelani, now known as al-Shara, and the sense of anticipation and waiting around what kind of leader he's going to be given his colorful background, I think is the way that you had put it.
We haven't met Al-Julani. His name is Ahmad Shara, but of course we spoke with people who met with him, including the UN envoy to Syria, and also Syrians who met with him. And they, of course, I mean, every now knows his background. He's a young man who was apparently very smart from an educated, well-to-do family in Damascus during the Iraqi war, our war in Iraq. He went to Iraq to fight the Americans and then became an extremist in terms of ideology, like many young people in the Middle East. And then after that, he formed a group called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. Initially was affiliated with Al-Qaeda, then they disconnected the affiliation, and they ruled some of the areas in Syria that was outside of the control of the regime called Idlib, northwest of Syria. And I've been in Idlib multiple times, and I've seen the evolution of the Hay'a, we call it Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, and him, of course, from an extremist group that dealt with the situation in a very rigid way to a more pragmatic group that cared more about the economy, building hospitals, loosening social restrictions. And I've seen that over the past 7 or 8 years in Idlib. And when he came to now become suddenly, no one knew him. I mean, he was unknown. I mean, there was a couple of interviews with him. Now that he's out in the open and speaking to BBC and CNN and other outlets and meeting with people, people are, kind of getting some idea about who is this person. And they say that he's very smart, that he cares about Syria. One of the people I talked to yesterday, he's a UN envoy, he said, he's very smart compared to the dumb person before him. And the dumb person before him, he cared about how to control Syrians. This guy cares about how to improve the income of the poor in Syria. So that's a good sign. So far, he said the right things in terms of opening Syria to make it a free market, to have representation of all components of the Syrian society, to respect women's rights, to be good with the neighbors, to only focus on the rebuilding of Syria. So far what he said is very good, but of course we have to see what will happen. He has evolved as a person, I believe, and I think he is more moderate now than 10 years ago, but we will have to see what will happen in Syria.
So just a bit of a waiting game there. Yes. Suzanne, can you speak to us about the situation that women are facing in Syria right now? How are women feeling about what's happening on the ground?
So when I think of Syrian women, I think of so many people come to my mind. I think of Rihab al-Qadi, one of the Syrian refugee women who came to Chicago as an engineer. She's Firas's wife, the one who we spoke about, the physician. She was able to recertify her degree and become an engineer, and then decided to come and work for Syrian Community Network as a case manager to help the other refugees. I think of Queen Zenobia, one of the early queens of Syria in ancient times. I think of Julia Dimna, the ancient queen also of my city, Homs. I think of Yusra Mardini, the famous team refugee Olympic swimmer. I think of Dr. Amani Ballor, the one who worked in the cave hospitals. under extreme pressure. You can see all their movies. I think of Wad al-Khatib, who had a film that was Oscar nominated. And she didn't win the Oscar, but she won the BAFTA in the UK, telling her story of struggle during the siege of Aleppo. So these are the stories that I think about. I think about my cousin Asma Akhras, who is one of the first elected officials here in Chicago as a school board member. I think of my friend Lena, who is an attorney who works for the public defender. So women, Syrian women, are doctors, are engineers, are lawyers, are teachers, and they fill every sector in the Syrian society. And so I think it's really important to remember that. And obviously there are concerns. People are worried about where their place is in society, and women are really pushing hard. But they don't really have to push that hard, because women have always been present in Syrian society and everywhere. If you look at Syrian drama, if you look at theater, if you look at opera, if you look at one of the famous opera singers, I forgot her name. What was her? The one that came, Lubna Qantar. She just recently came back after being a refugee here in the United States, and she went back. She's one of the most famous Syrian opera singers to be known in all of the Middle East. So I want everybody to frame, when you think about Syrian women, think about these women who have accomplished so much, and there's still more to come. Women are painters, are artists, are theater, are in the theater, and in everywhere, in every sector. And right now, within the Syrian American diaspora, many of the women are working within various groups and on how to rebuild the health sector within Syria. I think of another, one of the refugees, Dr. Rafif Musa, who used to be an OBGYN in Syria. Now she works in California, and she focuses on fertility medicine in Southern California. So, if I want everybody just to think of these powerful women, strong women, who have really done amazing work in Syria, whether they're in the diaspora, whether they are in Syria, and Syrian women will always be present in every part of the society, because I think it's in our DNA because of Queen Zenobia and Queen Julia Dumna. And I think of those. We have high aspirations, high drive, high motivation, and I know that the story for Syrian women will be amazing, and it will require some tweaking here and there. There will always be, some issues everywhere, just like we have here in the United States. Remember, we're losing some of our reproductive rights here, and where women are still paid less than men. And so this is a constant struggle worldwide.
Thank you for that. Maybe we can shift a little bit to talk about Syria's infrastructure and what you all have been seeing and witnessing. What is your take on the most urgent priorities for rebuilding Syria's infrastructure, and how can the international community be a part of supporting those solutions?
Sure. But before that, I will say that Syrian men are good also. So there are many famous Syrian American men, including the person who invented the iPhone. He's
the iPhone?
Steve Jobs is a son of a Syrian immigrant from my city, Homs. His dad is Abd Fattah al-Jandali. Actually, we passed by his house when we were visiting. And of course, the person who invented the ice cream cone is Syrian American, early in the 20th century. So, I mean, there's a lot of Syrians, of course, that sometimes we don't know that they are. Seinfeld, Danny Thomas, the governor of Indiana. He was a Republican governor a couple of terms ago. There's 200,000 Syrian Americans in the United States. Most of them are professionals, doctors and engineers and attorneys, and they're all successful. Because of the fact that Syria in general, Syrian family value education. And they have high drive because of the diversity of the population, the fact that went through a lot over the past 10,000 years. Some of the earliest civilizations are in Syria. As Suzanne mentioned, the first alphabet in Syria, the first musical note is invented in Syria or found in Syria. So Syrians are full of themselves. They have.
You seem like a very humble man.
High sense of accomplishment, but they are successful everywhere. So right now, Syria is semi-destroyed. Some estimates that the loss of GDP over the past 14 years is about $700 billion. $700 billion. And if we want to just rebuild the physical destruction in Syria, it's going to cost about $150 billion. If we want to go back to the GDP before the crisis, which was about $62 billion in 2010, it will take every year increase of 10% of investment and also 5% of productivity. So what the international community has to do is to help Syrians go through this phase of transition. Stability is very important. So because without stability, Syria may go to the same route that Libya or Iraq went through. We're going to have a bloodbath in Syria if we don't have stability. So the most important thing for the international community and for our government is to engage with the current de facto leaders, and do not push them to the breaking points that will be disconnected from engagement, because this is an opportunity for us to have Syria as a friend. Syria never has been a friend of the United States over the past 54 years or so. The last time Syria was a friend of the United States was in 1920, when at that time President Wilson sent a commission of Crane King. At that time they went and they asked Syrians about their aspirations, and Syrians said that we want to have democratic country similar to your country. And that report was put on the shelf. No one cared about it. But this is an opportunity for our government now to have this strategic country, small but strategic in the Middle East, where it's bordered by Turkey, by Lebanon, by Israel, by Jordan, by Iraq, in the Middle East. That is very important as our friend. We took it away from Russia and Iran field or reign, and now it could be potentially our friend. Engaging with the regime, making sure that we have a clear vision for what to come with the current government, and making sure that we have certain timeline for them to reach certain benchmarks on when it comes to human rights, when it comes to economics, when it comes to investment and so forth. And also make sure that the restrictions that are against the Syrian government is removed. Yesterday in the hearing of Senator Rubio, as a foreign minister, he mentioned the restrictions and the sanctions against Syria. As long as these sanctions against Syria continues, then there will be difficulty for people like me or the Syrian diaspora to reinvest in the rebuilding of their country. And the Syrian diaspora are very resourceful and they want to rebuild their country, and also for other countries in the region to rebuild. So I think it's important for us to engage, to remove the restrictions and the sanctions, and also to make sure that certain benchmarks when it comes to human rights respect in Syria are reached through engagement with the regime.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Did you have anything you'd like to add, Suzanne?
When we landed in Beirut, one of the taxi drivers that picked us up, he's a Syrian refugee that lives in Lebanon, and we asked him, are you planning to go back? And he said, yes, I want to go back, but when I know there's safety and there's stability and there's schools that I can put my children in, and a job, of course. So these are really important measures for people in order for them to go back, is to removing the sanctions, having those investments from the international community, helping the rebuilding of what has been destroyed. And what has been destroyed are, it's just so much. When we were in Homs, we went and walked in the neighborhood that I grew up in, and it was completely destroyed. It was just hollowed out. It's just buildings. Like, it looked like a picture from like World War II. And if you saw that movie, The Pianist, how like how he was hiding in one of the houses, and like that image. If you have that image, that's what it looked like in part of the city. And it was completely silent, and I just couldn't believe it. And I was trying to find the street where this is the street I walked in. This is the school I went to. You want to make sure that when refugees come back, they have something to come back to. It means there's schools, there's health clinics, there's all kinds of things for them to be able to raise their families. And this taxi driver also said that I'm waiting until the summer because right now there's no diesel fuel to heat my house. I need to make sure that it's warm enough. And so these are things that we need to take into account. Countries like Lebanon, Turkey, Jordan, to their credit, they took the biggest number of Syrian refugees when they have their own struggling economies and their own struggling infrastructure. So, God bless them for that. But at the same time, those countries don't have the resources to be able to sustain those families for a really long time. And they put obstacles in the way, and there's a huge anti-immigrant, anti-refugee sentiment in those countries, especially in Lebanon, and in the last few years in Turkey. So we need to make sure that there are these restrictions that are taken away so that people can go back and start to rebuild their lives. And it's not going to be easy. It's very challenging. Imagine, like you've been gone for 14 years somewhere where you come back, it's not going to be the same. Everything has changed. But people are eager to go back and to start the rebuilding process and to deal with the trauma and deal with the loss that they've experienced over the years. Even, I was telling Zaher, these houses, these Al-Hada houses, like how many birthday parties were in this house? How many graduation parties happened? How many grandparents lived here? How many, it's just like our lives, they're no different than us. And so like just thinking about that, like each wall, each window, hollowed out window has a story, and that story has a family in there, and that family had, went through so much for them to escape with their lives, including Zaher's sister. She lived in one of those neighborhoods, and she literally left. They left in the middle of the night, her whole family in their pajamas, and had to flee. And so these are the things that people have to now reconcile with, and it's going to take, years and years. But again, people are so eager to move on and to rebuild, because this is the happiest moment of their lives right now.
Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts on how the international community can best support Syria in the rebuilding of the infrastructure issues? I had read that 50% of schools in Syria are damaged or destroyed. And to your point, individuals who've been forced to flee or are displaced or are refugees have to come through a process of their own reckoning in terms of whether they would and can return, but also from a broader perspective in terms of the international community's responsibility to be supporting the rebuilding of the infrastructure. What are both of your thoughts on that?
So I think safety has to become, the first and foremost. Building of schools, having a home. There are many people who either lost their house or they need to go back and there are people living in their house. They have to figure those issues out. The most important thing is that that refugees return voluntarily. They should not be forced to go out and go back to back to Syria, because right now Syria is still not stable. There's still, you don't have the jobs and the housing and all those things that have been figured out. Already we saw like Austria right away froze all of the asylum applications. Okay, why? Like it's so quick, like the next day, are they that much of a burden to you in Austria? I saw somewhere where the health minister in Germany said, we don't want to lose the Syrian doctors, because there are over 300 Syrian doctors doing amazing work in Germany to help fill the gaps in this shortage of healthcare workers. So people should see refugees as an asset to them, and not right away start to push them out. So in order for people to go back, certain infrastructure and safety needs to be in place, whether it's schools, their homes, heat, jobs, financial security. All those things need to be in place for them to be able to go back to thrive. We don't want them to go back and have new hardships on top of those hardships that they've had in the last 14 years. So I'm hoping that there'll be many organizations. I'm trying to start something with some friends and family in order to thinking about how can we help facilitate a safe and like a response and a safe way so that they can go back and live thriving lives.
I think it's important to look at Syria as a very strategic country in the Middle East. That is the connection between Asia, Africa, and Europe. The reason that we had a refugee crisis that affected us is because of Syria, because of the human rights violation, because of the barrel bombs. And sometimes we think that these areas are distant and not going to be affected by them. There was an article was written by the New York Times senior reporter in the Middle East, Anne Bernard. Syria has changed the world. I really believe that Syria has changed the world because when you had millions of Syrian refugees going to Europe, that created a lot of anti-refugee and xenophobic sentiment. It affected us here. I think all of us are familiar with the travel ban. Candidate Trump in the first term, Muslim ban. He said that I'm going to prevent Syrians from coming to the United States, and the first executive order was travel ban, Muslim ban. Some of you probably demonstrated in O'Hare Airport against the travel ban. So these things affect us. Until now, we have this kind of sentiment. So let's keep it stable. I was in Ukraine multiple times. We have some Ukrainian friends here. I believe that what happened in Syria was prelude to what happened in Ukraine, because we allowed Putin to bomb people without accountability in Syria. And he's doing exactly the same thing in Ukraine. I was in Kiev and Lviv multiple times, and I see what they are doing. And I tell my friends, Ukrainian friends, this is what happened in Syria, and they know it. By the way, President Zelensky was one of the first leaders who congratulated the Syrian people for the liberation from the Assad regime, and also hopefully from Russia. So having an international conference to support Syria and the rebuilding of Syria is very important. We can lead, and it could be the legacy of President Trump that he will lead the rebuilding of Syria and also the rebuilding of Gaza now that we have a ceasefire. And that will stabilize the Middle East and will assert our moral authority as the country that cares about people and human rights and the welfare of the Syrians and the Palestinians and the Israelis and the Ukrainians. And I think that will be translated into a lot of fruits for us. We shouldn't be just looking at the areas in the Middle East through the prism of terrorism and security and oil, but we should care about the people also, which is the most important probably message that I want to convey to the people here.
Can I just add about the travel ban? You know, when the travel ban was announced, there were so many thousands of people marched to the airport, literally went to O'Hare Airport to protest this. And I see people who are here, like the Dugan sisters who are here. I got to meet them at the airport, and they were holding signs that we're all Muslim today. And like so many Chicagoans have stepped up and spoke up, and they want to support. They wanted to support Syrian refugees. They were against the travel ban, you know. And I know that now we have President Trump is back, and you know this will be another moment where another travel ban 2.0 will be coming into place. And I hope all of you and everyone in Chicago that Chicago will take its rightful place in the protesting and then speaking out and in supporting refugees, because this is what Chicagoans have done. They did this to my organization when hundreds of people lined up to become mentors for Syrian refugees. They donated, they volunteered their time. I see one of our volunteers, Anna, who's here. You know, just so many people gave so much of their time and effort and their voice in support of the Syrian refugees, and I hope that you will continue to do that again.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to both of you. We are going to transition now to Q&A. I kindly ask that those who have questions, please state your name, your organization, and your question, and then a sentence or two providing any context that you feel might be needed. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Kenneth Newman, and I work in soccer. And because of soccer, I have known tons of people who are Syrian and Assyrian, Lebanon, Iraq, the diaspora here, and that goes back over 50 years. So in terms of that, obviously the entire Syrian sports organizations and their Olympic committee has to be completely reformed. And that may be beyond your ability to question, but I'm curious, have there been Syrian athletes in Europe training for hopefully one day to represent Syria? And how many Syrians are there in Europe? 2 million, 3 million? And finally, is Interpol and other international organizations looking in Switzerland and the Canary Islands and, or not Canary, the Cayman Islands and the Jersey and the Channel Islands for any hidden Assad money?
So in terms of athletes, you have the famous swimmer, Yusra Mardini. And she won, I don't know what, I think she won silver or gold in Team Refugees in 2016. So she's one of the most famous athletes that's in Europe right now. And there are others, of course. And one of the famous revolutionaries was the soccer player Sahloul, that people have been using their songs. But he died in Syria. But he is kind of looked on as an icon. And but I'll let Zaher talk about the Interpol
part.
The harder part.
The more complex part.
Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's an estimated, the worth of the regime money is about $21 billion. That's the estimate. So a lot of money. And the source of the money in the last few years Syria became a narco state because of the Captagon. So it was, and the Assad regime used the Captagon to sponsor its activities and to send it actually to the region. So now that we have the fall of the Assad regime, no more, well, there's still a Captagon going, but most of the Captagon has gone. But 21 billion is a lot of money that can help in the rebuilding of Syria. There is a long list of people who are with the regime, who are on the list of in Europe. Because of their torture, and they oversaw torture in Sadnaya and others. And hopefully we will have a process of transitional justice where these people, including Assad, can be put in the court and they tried for what they have done to the Syrian people. As I mentioned, this is something that we have not witnessed in our lifetime since maybe the Nazis. And the Syrian chapter of this extreme human rights violation will not be closed unless we have a process of transitional justice, and that will be accompanied by peace building within the communities.
Thank you. Yes.
My name is Eric Mao. I run the organization called the Geopolitical Forum. So I have some friends from there and here. So hopefully we're going to hang out after this. And I appreciate I find your experience, Dr. Sahloul and Akhras, and Ms. Akhras, very relatable. I have a little background myself, so I find it very relatable also about your remarks about the women's accomplished women from Syria. I have a little background in that too, believe me. My question is, well, given this, I think it's pretty obvious for me because a lot of people are already with you wholeheartedly, but we cannot lose sight of the fact that this is a panel of lack of diversity of opinion. So maybe this is for different event. You have different deals. There's always two sides.
Sir, what's your question?
Coming up. But I really appreciate your views and experience for what it is. So I have a question. What's my question? Oh, right now, you have this. You have the triumph. You have the victory in Syria for Syrian people, for the country. But have you thought about the foreigners, the foreign countries, foreign forces in Syria right now, carving up their shares permanently or temporarily? We don't know. What do you think about that? Israel is in there. U.S. since Obama time 2014 has been in there, and Turkey, and the Kurds, among others. So what is your view about that?
Thank you,
as
sir.
Syrians?
Thank you.
I mean, I think that's a valid point. Whenever you have a civil war, you will have a lot of geopolitical forces intervening. So, I mean, right now in Sudan, for example, which is the worst humanitarian crisis in our lifetime, you have Russia, you have the United States, you have the United Arab Emirates, you have Saudi Arabia, you have Egypt. All of them are trying to intervene. And when you have a civil war, that opens the door for foreign intervention, as you've mentioned. At one point, there were 13 different countries fighting in Syria through different parties. Some of them now are out. Some of them are still there. Syrians want Syria for Syrians only. And whether you are a Syrian Kurd or Syrian Turkoman or Syrian Albanian or Syrian Christian or Syrian Jew or Syrian Muslim or Alawite, and there's 39 different ethnicity and religious group in Syria. You are the ones who should be deciding the future of Syria, not foreign factors, as you've mentioned.
Thank you. Next question.
Max Overholt, and I'm not here representing any organization. I would like to know, how big would you say the concern is in Syria that it could potentially go, say, the way Iraq did after Saddam fell?
That's a very important question, and it's very concerning to us in Syria. Not only Iraq, but also Libya. We had where you have a regime, a very brutal regime that has been in existence for a long time, and suddenly they're out. So you will have all kinds of forces that are going to create chaos. And intervention, as you mentioned, for an intervention that can feed into this. So the most important thing, from my perspective as Syrian, who understands Syria inside out, is to have stability and make sure that people now have bread to eat, because that's the main concern. Electricity, job building, rebuilding of Syria. And if we have stability for sometimes, I think Syrian can rebuild a beautiful model in the Middle East.
We also have just a few questions that are coming in online. This is from a clinical mental health counselor asking, Syria impresses me as currently having to deal with a collective case of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. What is being done to address this type of issue?
There's a lot that's being addressed in the works right now. This is one of the most important things that Zaher started a group called HHR, Health Recovery. And one of the ways to help people is through mental health resources and services. We had recently met also with people from Heartland Alliance and Kovler Center to discuss how we can bring mental health services to Syria, especially for people who are victims of torture. This is probably the most important factor. And getting people, as they are resettling back, dealing with the trauma that they've had to leave everything, lose everything, and then come back. And then in addition to the people who are living there, who had to deal with the 14 years of lack of services, bombs around them. Like Zaher's parents lived for 4 years in Homestead when it was under siege. And so this is going to be one of the most important issues that we need to deal with and build infrastructure around so that there are mental health services that are culturally and linguistically relevant for the people to address their concerns and to help them in their post-war adjustment. And I think this is really something that everybody should invest in.
Yeah, I totally agree. And sometimes, when people mention trauma and violence and displacement impact of that on population, especially the most vulnerable, PTSD comes to mind. PTSD is an extreme case of mental health trauma related to certain things. But what happens when you have a war like this, that everyone is traumatized somehow. Some of it will be depression, some of it will be anxiety, some of it will be phobia, and some of it will be PTSD. Us also, Syrians who are in the United States, are somehow traumatized because of what we have witnessed to our family members and the displacement and the violence and the videos that we are seeing. In general, in the Middle East, the people do not talk openly about their mental health. It's kind of taboo. So we have to figure out how to treat the population. It's going to take generation to heal the trauma that happened. One of my friends started a clinic to treat the victims of torture that came recently from Saydnaya. And he told me that he treated about 100 plus prisoners who were liberated a couple of weeks ago. And they are afraid from noise. So if someone is speaking, actually they get anxious. And they are afraid from someone knocking on the door because that is associated with torture with them. And they cannot sleep and they cannot eat well. And they have domestic violence because of they're difficult for them to integrate in the society. It's going to take huge effort and holistic approach to deal with the victims of torture. We're talking about tens of thousands of people who were tortured in Syria. Besides, of course, the mental health trauma related to displacement, to bombs, to chemical weapons, and all of these, and uncertainty of the future.
Yes, please, sir.
Good evening. My name is Nashwan. I work for the United Nations Foundation, a Syrian refugee and a torture survivor. My first question to Suzanne, you mentioned the efforts that ordinary people can do to help refugees here in the United States. My question, what ordinary people can do to help rebuilding Syria? What the ideas you can suggest to them? And my second question to Dr. Zaher, taking into consideration that not only Syrian people were suffering from the Syrian regime, most of the countries in the region, they have problems with the regime. That's why they are eager now to help the new rulers in Damascus. How United States can guarantee that there is a balance between the regional influence and the Syrian sovereignty, so we will not create another copy of the Iranian influence in Iraq.
So,
thank you.
Thank you, Nishwan, for your question. So all of you can donate to organizations that are serving refugees, specifically my organization, Syrian Community Network. We're celebrating 10 years of service to the refugee community. And on March 20th, we're, yes, it's a clapping moment. And March 20th, we're going to have an event, and I hope I'm inviting all of you to attend. So that's very important. People can mentor, like Anna, who is here. She's one of our best mentors who supports the refugees in tutoring and in support. Call the ways you can help right now for Syria. Every one of you should call your congressman and congresswoman and your senator and spread the word to ask them to vote for lifting the sanctions. This is the most important thing. If the sanctions are lifted, money will pour in, the diaspora can help, all of us can help, we can donate, we can support, we can transfer money, we can, right now, prior to, before the regime fell, we couldn't even wire money to our families. This is how bad, the sanctions, you can't buy anything with credit card, you can't do anything. So this is the most important thing. Number two, spread the word, humanize the stories that when you see these stories, when you hear about sometimes when we hear like Jolani this and ISIS that, and look at Syrians in a different prism, please. Syria comes from a very old civilization, 3,500 BC. Syrians are very diverse ethnically. They were part of the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire, the Armenians. You have Syrian Armenians. It was part of the Ottoman Empire. It was part of so many other great empires. Famous scientists and doctors and lawyers. Think of Syrians in that light versus the narrative that's always sometimes given to us on the news. And I always cringe every time I see those things and I hear those things. And because the good stories are never told. These are things that are very important. And make sure that you advocate. You continue to advocate here within the United States. Our voice is our biggest treasure. You don't know how lucky we are to be able to do that, to be able to pick up the phone and call our congressmen and senators and advocate for people, advocate for the poor. This is something that's really precious, and I feel like we don't take advantage of what the gifts that we have here. And so advocate for lifting the sanctions, advocate for refugee resettlement, and advocate for people to be supported as a whole. So sorry, that was a long answer.
That was a beautiful answer. Thank you for giving us ideas, opportunities, and very direct ways to turn our local advocacy and activism into real action. We appreciate that. We do actually have time for one more very quick question. Sorry, I know we've got two people in line.
My name is Samir Wasif. I've run into you in the hallways sometimes at Christ. It's a pleasure. Dr. Zaher, do you know of any involvement in the Arab world's support in response to the revolution? Anything Egyptians are doing, other Arab countries in the general vicinity?
Maybe I can link it to Nishwan's question also. Yes, definitely. But before that, I want to mention that MediGlobal has started a Syria Rebuilding Fund or Recovery Fund. And in the first few days, we raised about $100,000. Our goal is to raise $1 million. And also we had an outpouring interest of mostly Syrian American physicians who want to rebuild the healthcare system in Syria. So if you want to help rebuilding of this very strategic country that is connected to us through the Syrian diaspora and many other means, you can contribute to the fund, mediglobal.org, and there's details there. There was a recent meeting by the Arab League in Saudi Arabia where all Arab countries attended, and the focus was Syria and how to stabilize Syria and how to rebuild Syria. So Saudi Arabia is invested in the rebuilding, it looks like, and Qatar and Turkey, and these are the main three countries in the region. But other countries usually follow these countries in the region. Jordan also is quite involved. Egypt also started to get involved in the situation. Some of them are hesitant to pull their support behind the current de facto leaders because they're not sure. But I think with time that will be more clear. It is very important, Nishwan, for the United States to provide leadership and not to turn away from Syria the same way we turned away from Libya. And that created a lot of war over there. Some of our, we have major flaws in our foreign policy, frankly. All of us are aware of that, especially when it comes to the Middle East, because we do not humanize the people in the Middle East, I believe, the same way that we humanize other people. So we have to look at Syrians and as Palestinians and as people in the Middle East as assets to us. They are their friends. They love the American culture. They want to come here and work here. So we have to treat them as everyone else. And if we provide the moral leadership, then I think the whole Middle East will thrive. Because we have a lot of values that the Middle East is hungry to. The rule of law, the organization, the leadership, the culture, the emphasis on education, human rights, equality, all of these things people are hungry for. And we can be a model for the Middle East if we humanize the people of the Middle East.
Thank you. 5 seconds? Like really? 5 seconds? Okay.
Maria Dmitrov-Kopeniak, on behalf of the Ukrainian community, I want to thank you, sir. I want to thank you, Dr. Zaher. I want to thank you, Suzanne, for all the work you've been doing in Ukraine, for all the work you've been doing in Syria. It really is all connected. It really all is in parallel. And I hope the next wall that is going to fall is going to be occupied territories of Ukraine.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
So unfortunately, we're running out of time and we have to wrap up, but I want to express my gratitude to you both. It was humbling to hear your stories. Thank you for bringing what is happening on the ground right now in terms of spirit, energy, life, all of the information and opportunities also to support you both in the extraordinary work that you're doing. You are Syrian American, Chicagoan. We have these extraordinary leaders here in our own city. So I encourage you to check them out, visit their website, come up, get to know them, introduce yourself. And thank you so much again for coming out tonight.
Thank you.